Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Sister Story Time with your favorite TJ, Sister Chaya. Back again today with the Creation of Patriarchy book by Gerda Lerner, and we're on chapter 9, which is called The Covenant, and I'm just going to jump right into it. So the answer to the question, who creates life, lies at the core of religious belief systems. Generativity encompasses both creativity, the ability to create something out of nothing, and procreativity, the capacity to produce offspring. We have seen how religious explanations of generativity have shifted from the mother goddess as the sole principle of universal fertility to the mother goddess assisted in her fertility by male gods or human kings, then to the concept of symbolic creativity as expressed first in the name, then the creative spirit. We have seen as well the shift in the pantheon of gods from the all-powerful mother goddess to the all-powerful storm god, whose female consort represents a domesticated version of the fertility goddess. It remains for the pantheon of the gods to be replaced by one single powerful male god, and for that god to incorporate the principle of generativity in both of its aspects. This shift, which occurs in many different forms in different cultures, occurs for Western civilization in the book of Genesis. The creation story in Genesis departs significantly from the creation stories of other peoples in the region. It is Yahweh who is the sole creator of the universe and all that exists in it. Unlike the chief gods of neighboring peoples, Yahweh is not allied with any female goddess, nor does he have familial ties. There is no longer any maternal source for the creation of the universe and for life on earth, nor is there any indication that creativity and procreativity are linked. Quite to the contrary, God's act of creation is entirely unlike anything humans can experience. The great advance in abstract thinking, represented by the symbolification of creativity into a concept, a name, the breath of life, is echoed in the opening words. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Genesis 1:3. God's word, God's breath creates. The metaphor of the divine breath as life-giving is elaborated in Genesis 2:7. Then the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul. Then God formed the beasts of the field and fowl of the air, and brought them unto the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man would call every living creature, that was to be the name thereof. Genesis 2:19. Thus, the divine breath creates, but human naming gives meaning and order. And God gives the power of that kind of naming to Adam. If we read the Hebrew word Adam as humankind, then we would expect God to give the power of naming both to the male and the female of the species. But in this instance, God granted that power specifically to the human male only. This might have been so simply because the female had not yet been created, but the pattern recurs after the creation of Eve, when Adam named her as he had named the animal. And the man said, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." Genesis 2:23. The naming here not only is a symbolic act of creativity, but it defines woman in a very special way as a natural part of man, flesh of his flesh, in a relationship which is a peculiar inversion of the only human relationship for which such a statement can be made, namely the relationship of mother to child. The man here defines himself as the mother of the woman. Through the miracle of divine creativity, a human being was created out of his body, the way the human mother brings forth life out of her body. The very next sentence explains the meaning of this connectedness in human terms. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Genesis 2:24. The creation of woman out of man's body is here taken to impose a very special interpretation upon this event. Woman was created as part of man, therefore man must cleave to her, choosing her above all other kinship relationships, and they shall be one flesh. That flesh, the man's naming formula tells us, shall be the man, for he has here by the act of God's creation and by his own power of naming, defined his authority over her as integral and binding. This authority also implies intimacy. It implies interdependency, and it has, in centuries of theological interpretation, been used to upgrade the church relationship and with it, dignity of wives. The ambiguity and complexity of this passage have given rise to greatly differing interpretations, which we will discuss below. Name giving is a powerful activity, a symbol of sovereignty in biblical times, in line with ancient Oriental tradition. It also had a magical quality, giving meaning and predicting the future. When Hagar's son is named Ishmael, his fate is predicted. Such naming power is given both to men and women in the Bible. Except for special circumstances, mothers or fathers choose their children's names in the biblical narrative. But there is another kind of naming, which we might call renaming, which signifies the assumption of a new and powerful role for the person so renamed. We have mentioned earlier the renaming with 50 names of the young god Marduk upon his ascendance to power. Similarly, God renames persons after important events have occurred. After the covenant, he changes Abram to Abraham, for a father of a multitude of nations have I made thee, Genesis 17:5, and Sarai, Sarah. This lends added significance to the fact that Adam, who uses the power of naming first in the creation story cited above, after the fall renames the woman Eve. The impression is given strongly and repeatedly that the male shares in the divine power of naming and renaming. The most powerful metaphors of gender in the Bible have been those of woman, created of man's rib, and of Eve, the temptress, causing humankind to fall from grace. These have, for over 2 millennia, been cited as proof of divine sanction for the subordination of women. As such, they have had a powerful impact on defining values and practices in regards to gender relations. While it is to be expected that interpretations of a poetic, mythical, and folklore interpretations of a poetic, mythical, and folkloristic composite, such as the book of Genesis, would vary so as to fit the needs of the interpreters. We should note that the tradition of interpretation has been overwhelmingly patriarchal, and that the various feminist interpretations made by individual women in the past 700 years have been made against and entrenched and theologically sanctioned tradition long antedating Christianity. There are 2 seemingly contradictory versions of the creation story in Genesis. The J version appears in Genesis 2:18 through 25 and was written several centuries before the P version, which appears ahead of it in Genesis 1:27 through 29. In the J version, God creates Eve out of Adam's rib, while in the P version, male and female created Edom. Biblical criticism over several centuries has focused on the discrepancies between the 2 versions and has argued the merits of one over the other. The P version parallels the Mesopotamian Enuma Elish creation story in its various details and in the order of events. This might explain the androgynous statement about creation, male and female created them, as reflecting the influence of Mesopotamian religious ideas. Some interpreters have attempted to extend that androgynous resonance to the J version by pointing out that the Hebrew word Adam, meaning humankind, stands for the generic term for humanity, including men and women, and that the capitalizing of that word in Adam is a late error based on androcentric assumptions. The effect of that error, reprinted in tens of billions of versions of the Bible in every language, was to lend added weight to the traditional interpretations of Genesis 2:18 through 25. The creation of woman from Adam's rib has been interpreted in the most literal sense for thousands of years to denote the God-given inferiority of woman. Whether that interpretation has rested upon the rib as being one of Adam's lower parts and therefore denoting inferiority, or on the fact that Eve was created from Adam's flesh and bone, while he was created from earth, the passage has historically had profoundly patriarchal symbolic meaning. As an example, we might cite the relatively benign interpretation of John Calvin. Since in the person of the man the human race had been created, the common dignity of our whole nature was without distinction. The woman was nothing else than an accession to the man. Certainly, it cannot be denied that the woman also, though in the second degree, was created in the image of God. We may therefore conclude that the order of nature implies that the woman should be the helper of the man. The vulgar proverb, indeed, is that she is a necessary evil, but the voice of God is rather to be heard, which declares that woman is given as a companion and an associate to the man to assist him to live well. Elsewhere, Calvin comments, Adam was taught to recognize himself in his wife as in a mirror, and Eve, in her turn, to submit herself willingly to her husband as being taken out of him. Feminists, in trying to argue this meaning away, have used a variety of ingenious interpretations. These include a clever argument by 17-year-old Rachel Spake, an English clergyman's daughter, who in 1617 observed that woman was created from refined matter, while Adam was created from dust. She was not produced from Adam's foot to be his low inferior, nor from his head to be his superior, but from his side near his heart to be his equal. More than 2 centuries later, the American Sarah Grimke focused her interpretation on the term helpmeet. It was to give him a companion, in all respects his equal, one who was like himself, a free agent, gifted with intellect and endowed with immortality, not a partaker merely of his animal gratification, but able to enter into all his feelings as a moral and responsible being. If this had not been the case, how could she have been a helpmeet for him? She was a part of himself, as if Jehovah designed to make the oneness and identity of man and woman perfect and complete. This somewhat circular argument, while strong in its lutheran assumptions of the individual's free will and moral responsibility, avoids the implications of the rib image of woman's creation. In a bold attempt to reread, not rewrite the Bible without the blinders of patriarchal bias, the modern feminist theologian Phyllis Tribal provides us with a challenging reinterpretation of the creation story, which she views as imbued with the vision of a transsexual deity. Phyllis Tribal's 20th century reinterpretation is quite similar to Grimke's, although she seems to be unaware of Grimke's work. Tribal sees a similarity in Adam's creation from dust and Eve from his ribs, in that both are made of fragile materials which Yahweh must process before they have life. She also considers the fact that Eve was created last as evidence of her being the culmination of creation. Another feminist theologian stresses the essential similarity in the basic statement made about and the crown of his creation. Man and woman were made for each other. Together they constitute mankind, which is in its full and essential nature bisexual. In an argument based on linguistic considerations, R. David Friedman argues that the term make him a helpmate should be translated to mean a power equal to man. In either case, there is little evidence in other parts of the Bible to support these optimistic business interpretations. Let us consider the various sources of the biblical creation story. Among the Sumerian elements incorporated and transformed in the biblical narrative are the eating of the forbidden fruit, the concept of the tree of life, and the story of the flood. The description of the Garden of Eden parallels the Sumerian Garden of Creation, which is also Sumerian creation myth. What Mother Goddess in her sack allowed 8 lusty plants to sprout in the garden, but the gods were forbidden to eat from them. Still, the water god ate from them. The Ninhursag condemned him to die. Accordingly, Ada's and Eve's organs fell ill. The fox appealed in his behalf, and the goddess agreed to commute the sentence of death. She created a special healing deity for each afflicted organ. When it came to the rib, she said, "To the goddess Ninti, I have given birth for you." In Sumerian, the word Ninti has a double meaning, namely female ruler of the rib and female ruler of life. In Hebrew, the word Hawa means she who creates life, which suggests that there may be a fusion of the Sumerian Ninti with the biblical Eve. The choice of Adam's rib as the locus of Eve's creation may simply reflect the incorporation of the Sumerian myth. Speculation suggests another fascinating possibility by associating the Hebrew Hawa with the Aramaic meaning of the word, which is serpent. Whether one accepts the Sumerian origin of the creation story as a valid explanation for the metaphor of Adam's rib or not, it is significant that historically that explanation was ignored as a more sexist explanation prevailed. The symbolism of the Genesis story suggests a dichotomy between Adam, created of dust, and Eve, successor to the ancient fertility goddess, created out of a part of a human body, Yahweh. The dichotomy becomes a vision of labor is decreed by Yahweh, this time as punishment. Adam will work to sweat of his brow, Eve will give life in pain and raise the generation. It may be worth noting that the punishment meted out makes of man's work a burden, but it condemns to pain and suffering not women's work, but woman's childbearing body, the natural outcome of woman's sexuality. There is another aspect to the Genesis passage which deserves our notice. The divine originator of human life, who in the Sumerian story was the goddess Ninhursag, is now Yahweh, Father God and Lord. He may, if we credit the T version, have created them, male and female, but if we credit the J version, he created the male exactly in his image, and he created woman another way. David Bakan, in a highly original and stimulating interpretation of the book of Genesis, argues that the central theme of the book is the assumption of paternity by males. When men make the scientific discovery that conception results from intercourse between men and women, they understand that they have the power to procreate, which previously they had believed only the gods possessed. Men, in their desire to legitimate the prerogative, the great discovery appears to allow them learn to distinguish between creation, divine, and procreation, male. They replaced matrilineal descent with patrilineal descent, and in order to guarantee paternal authority, demanded female virginity before marriage and absolute fidelity of the wife in marriage. With this explanation, Bacon follows Abel's argument, which he have earlier discussed, but he adds a major metaphorical device is to conceptualize the male sexual exodus as seed. This way of thinking attributes all the genetic endowments to the male and none to the female. Bacon also argues that in this transition, men take on the child provider, protector role, which had been previously the female role. He calls this the effeminization of the male. While I find Bacon's main thesis persuasive and some of his points coincide with my findings, I consider his reasoning excessively deterministic and his method ahistorical and highly subjective. A case in point is his reading of Genesis 6:1-4. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took themselves wives whomsoever they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for that he also is flesh. Therefore shall his days be 120 years. The Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. The same were the mighty men of renown. Bacon considers that account of divine intercourse with mortals the keystone in the arch of development he describes in his thesis. He points out that it deals with four basic human concerns, namely origin, death, property, and power. The verses indicate the origin of the men of valor. They indicate that life is terminal, although death comes only after a generous 120 years of life. They indicate prerogatives of use, the essence of property, with the respect to the daughters of men or the sons of God, who take whomsoever they choose. They indicate that the men who emerged from the mating were men of power. Bacon rests his case on a very difficult and controversial section of Genesis. Gerhard von Rad interprets this text quite differently. He reads, sons of God, Elohim, as angels, and calls the union of angels with mortal women the angel marriage. The Nephilim, which spring from this union, are by all accounts mythological giants. Von Rad, who interprets the Bible solely as a religious document, considers this angel marriage one example of the sinfulness of God's creatures, from the fall to Lot's sin to the flood. The inherent sinfulness of men is illustrated in these incidents, followed by God's punishment, and finally in the covenant by God's redemptive mercy. E.A. Spicer considers that the nature of the great fragment is such as to discourage confident interpretation. He, too, regards the Elohim as divine beings, and regards their mating with human females as an abomination. He cites the striking similarity of the story of the giants with Assyrian myth, in which the storm god Cashapp must fight a formidable stone monster. Spicer offers no comment on the women in the story. I believe Bacon erred in taking the term sons of God literally as applying to human males. The reference to the giants of old and the similarity not only to the Assyrian myth, but to the Sumerian and Greek myths of origin, which feature mythical giants in combat with God, seem to be persuasive. To my mind, what is significant in the text is the reference to human women as the daughters born to men. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, it is not explained how men came to multiply, but the omission of women from the process seems to me highly significant. One would have expected the passage to read, when mothers gave birth to men and they began to multiply. The text written by Jay in the 10th century BC indicates that patriarchal assumptions about procreation were then already well established. The writer sees no need to explain why humans are born to men. In fact, this is a prevailing assumption throughout Genesis. God names Isaac the son of Abraham, and this language is used throughout in the chronology. The generations of the sons of Noah are the sons of their fathers. So unto Eber were born two sons, Genesis 10:25. It is, of course, logical and to be expected that in a patriarchal society, the family line would be traced through the father. But my point is that this metaphorical means of ordering kinship was somehow transformed into a counterfactual statement about reality. Not only the tracing of lineage, procreation itself has been turned into a male act. There are no mothers involved in it. In the prayers to Ishtar, as to other fertility goddesses, one of the praiseworthy attributes of the goddess was that she opened the wombs of women. In Genesis, that language is used solely in reference to Yahweh. In Genesis 29:31, and the Lord saw that Leah was hated, and he opened her womb. And Genesis 30:22 through 23, and God remembered Rachel and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. Similarly, Eve says, after she conceived and bore Cain, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Genesis 4:1. Procreativity then is clearly defined as emanating from God, who opens the wombs of women and blesses the seed of men. Yet, within this patriarchal frame of reference, the procreative role of the wife and mother is honored. In the story of the fall, the curse of mortality which has fallen on Adam and Eve is symbolically softened by giving them the immortality that comes through generation, through procreativity. In this regard, man and woman stand in the same relationship with God. One might also interpret this aspect of the fall as indicating that woman, in her role as mother, is the carrier of God's redemptive and merciful spirit. The decisive change in the relationship of man to God occurs in the story of the covenant, and it is defined in such a way as to marginalize it. With the covenant, humans enter historical time. Henceforth, their collective immortality becomes an aspect of the covenant they have made with Yahweh. Their passage through time and history is a manifestation of the carrying out of Yahweh's promise. Their actions and collective behavior are interpreted and judged in the light of their covenant obligations. The covenant also, more literally, is what unites the 12 disparate tribes into a nation. Before the building of the temple, the shrine of the covenant is the center of their religious life. The ritual of the covenant, circumcision, symbolizes the rededication of each male child, each family to the covenant obligation. It is neither accidental nor insignificant that women are absent from the covenant in each of its aspects. Yahweh makes several covenants with Israel, one with Noah, Genesis 9:8 through 17, two with Abram, Genesis 15:7 through 18, and Genesis 17:1 through 13, and one with Moses, Exodus 3:6 through 9, 21 through 23. The covenant with Noah is preparatory to the other covenant. Yahweh pledges never again to send a flood to destroy the earth and its creatures, and he appoints the rainbow as a token of the covenant. The covenant with Moses, including the Decalogue, is a concrete elaboration of the covenant relationship established with Abraham. Since it does not basically alter the concepts of gender implied in the earlier covenant, it falls beyond the scope of our investigation. The essential definition of the relationship of the chosen people to their God and of the covenant community occurs in the covenant with Abraham, and it is these we will analyze further here. In Genesis 15, the earlier promise God has made to Abram of both land and offspring is formalized and made irrevocable by a covenant ritual. Since the Israelites are promised the actual occupation of the land only in future generations, this passage initiates their entry into historical time. language used to describe the process of generation. God expresses his purpose in these words addressed to Abram. He that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. Genesis 15:4. He asked Abram to count the stars and promised him, so shall thy seed be. Genesis 15:5. And unto thy seed I have given this land. Genesis 15:18. Male seed thus acquired the power and blessing of the procreativity which lodges in Yahweh. The metaphor of the male seed implanted in the female womb, the furrow, the earth, is older than the period of the writing of the Old Testament. It derives most likely from an agricultural context. It occurs, for example, in the story of the courtship of Inanna and Tamuzi in the so-called herder wedding song. But it should be noted that the frank and graphic description of the sexual act in the Sumerian poem, in which Inanna asks, "Who will plow my vulva? Who will plow my field?" To which question the poet answers, "May the king Tamuzi plow them for you," never confuses the metaphor with the actual process. It refers, for example, to Tamuzi as he who was born from a fertile womb. What happens in Genesis is that an older metaphor becomes transformed so as to strengthen patriarchal meaning. God's blessing of Abram's seed lends divine sanction to the transfer of procreativity from female to male. Yahweh's main covenant with Abram is set forth in Genesis 17, which is part of the P document. Here, the covenant ritual is more formal and involves the active participation of Abram. God promises Abram, who has prostrated himself before him, "Behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be the father of a multitude of nations." Genesis 17:5, and further, "And I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee through generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee and to thy seed after thee." Genesis 17:7. Yahweh reiterates that he will give the land of Canaan to Abram for an everlasting possession. It is at this point that Yahweh adds to the significance of the ritual by the renaming of Abram and Sarai. What does God ask of Abram? He asks acceptance that he will be the God of Israel, he alone and no other. And he demands that his people which worship him shall be set apart from other people by a bodily sign, a clearly identifiable token. "This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and ye shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of a covenant betwixt me and you." Genesis 17:9-10. We must take note of the fact that Yahweh makes a covenant with Abraham alone, not including Sarah, and that in doing so, he gives divine sanction to the leadership of the patriarch over his family and tribe. Abraham incorporates the tribe and the family in a manner which Roman law at a much later period will institutionalize as pater familias. Sarah is mentioned in the covenant passage only as the bearer of Abraham's seed, "And I will bless her, and moreover I will give thee a son of her. Yeah, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall come out of her." Genesis 17:16. While Abraham and Sarah are equally blessed as progenitors of kings and nations, the covenant relationship is only with males. First with Abraham, then explicitly with Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac, who is referred to only as Abraham's son. Moreover, the community of the covenant is divinely defined as a male community, as can be seen by the selection of the symbol chosen as tokens of the covenant. Commentators have mainly focused on the form of the covenant, which bears a strong resemblance to Hittite royal treaty. In these royal treaties, a vassal is obligated to keep the commands specified in the treaty by the Hittite king. It is thus a contract between unequal partners. The vassal must trust in the benevolence of the sovereign, but he is bound to carry out his treaty obligations. Usually, the treaty would be sealed by an oath and some solemn ceremony. Commentators have pointed out that there are striking formal parallels between the covenant with Moses, as described in Deuteronomy, Exodus, Joshua, and the royal treaty. This would be in line with historic development, whereby the 12 tribes began to become consolidated into a confederacy through the Mosaic covenant. With the formal acceptance of the Decalogue, the ceremony of the Ark of the Covenant, and male adult circumcision functioning as the binding oath and solemn ceremony. There is a strong likelihood that the emphasis on the covenant in the peace document and its reiteration in references to God's covenant with David, 2 Samuel 23, 1-5, and 2 Samuel 7, 1-17, reflect the political needs at the time of the writing to legitimate the claim of David's kingship. Yahweh gave Abraham the land and promised to bless his seed and that of his descendants. Moses united the people by making them each pledge adherence to the covenant. David by claiming direct descendants from Abraham and reasserting the claim to the land and leadership by way of the covenant with Moses made of the tribes a nation. Land, power, and nationhood were the promise implicit in the covenant. While commentators have discussed the political and religious implications of the covenant at great length, they have not paid much attention to explaining the nature of the token which seals the covenant. The comments on circumcision have been uniformly unenlightened. We are told that circumcision has widely practiced in this ancient Near East for reasons of hygiene, as preparation for sexual life, as a sacrifice, and a mark of distinction. Babylonians, Assyrians, and Phoenicians did not practice it, but some Egyptians and many Mesopotamian people did. That the practice was ancient is attested by pictorial evidence dating back to 2300 BC and by references to flint knives being used in the ceremony, which would mean it antedated the Bronze Age. Commentators all agree that the rite underwent a decisive transformation in Israel, not only by the religious significance attached to it, but by its being moved from puberty to infancy. Among most people, circumcision was a puberty rite, which presumably prepared men for sexual and procreative life. That fact and the way in which the Israelites transformed the rite therefore deserve closer attention. Why was the circumcised penis chosen as the particular organ to be a token? If, as a number of commentators have suggested, Yahweh intended this bodily marking merely to distinguish his people from all others, why were the markings not placed on the forehead, the chest, the finger? If, as other commentators have suggested, the rite was merely hygienic, why was this patriarchal hygienic rite, which affected only males, chosen from among the number of possible rites and customs pertaining to health and nutrition, which could have served as well? John Calvin, for one, was conscious of the problems raised by this biblical passage and forthrightly attempted to deal with them in his commentary. Ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin. Very strange and unaccountable would this command at first sight appear. The subject treated of is the sacred covenant. And who can say that it is reasonable for the sign of so great a mystery to consist in circumcision? But as it was necessary for Abraham to become a fool in order to prove himself obedient to God, so whosoever is wise will both soberly and reverently receive what God speaks to us foolishly and which plants it in the female womb. Nothing could be better served to impress man with the vulnerability of this organ and with his dependence on God for his fertility or immortality. The offering of no other part of the body could have sent so vivid and descriptive a message to man of the connection between his reproductive capacity and the great God. Since Abraham and the men of his household underwent the rite of circumcision as adults, the act itself, which must have been painful, was both their trust and faith in God and their submission to his will. The symbolism implicit in circumcision is powerful in its patriarchal reverberation. Not only does it signify that procreativity now lies in God and in human males, but it also links it with land and power. Psychoanalytic theory has suggested that the penis is the symbol of power for men and women in Western civilization and has regarded circumcision as a symbolic substitute for castration. This explanation leads us to a historical reference of interest. At the time of the writing of the Bible and earlier, priests and priestesses of the fertility goddess Ishtar dedicated their sexuality to the goddess. Some accepted voluntary virginity or celibacy, while others engaged in ritual sexual intercourse in the goddess's honor. In either case, humans sacrificed their own sexuality in order to celebrate and enhance the fertility of the goddess. It is not inconceivable that the great rite of circumcision demanded as a token of the covenant represents an adaptation of the old Mesopotamian rite, but transmuted as to celebrate the fertility of the one God and his blessing of male procreation. What is most striking is the omission of any symbolic or ritual role for the mother in process of this procreation. God blesses Abraham's seed as though it were self-generating. The image of the breast of the fertility goddess nurturing the earth and the fields has been replaced by the image of the circumcised penis, signifying the covenant contract between mortal men and God. Collective immortality in the form of many generations of children, land, power, and victory over their enemies is promised to the people of the covenant, if they fulfill their obligations, among which circumcision is primary, and the uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Genesis 17:14. Acceptance of monotheism, circumcision, and observance of God's laws given to Moses are the obligations of the chosen people and will mark them off from their neighbors. But their cohesion and purity must be guaranteed by male circumcision and strict female virginity before marriage. Sexual control, which assures the dominance of the father, is here elevated not merely to a human social arrangement incorporated into man-made law, as, for example, in the Mesopotamian law code. It is presented as the will of God expressed in his covenant with the men of Israel. To the question, who creates life? Genesis answers Yahweh, and the God-like male created. It remains for us to discuss the third basic religious question: what is the source life is similarly made substantial. One can gain it by eating a certain food or plant of life. The Epic of Gilgamesh, there are two segments pertinent to our question. One is the experience of the wild man in Enkidu, who lives in harmony with nature and to whom the animals speak. After he is befriended by a harlot who civilizes him by having sexual intercourse with him for 7 days, the animals flee him. It was not as before, but now he had wisdom, broader understanding. And the harlot said to him, Thou art wise in you. Art become like a god. The acquisition of sexual knowledge separates Enkidu from nature. Human knowledge is here overlaid with sexual meaning and with the suggestion that it makes Enkidu closer to the gods than to the animals. The second theme is man's quest for immortality. Gilgamesh, after the death of his beloved friend Enkidu, roams the earth to search for the secret of immortality. After many adventures, he is offered a plant, a secret of the gods, whereby a man may regain his life's breath, but he is robbed of it by a serpent. Although Gilgamesh is a semi-god, he is ultimately denied the secret of immortality, which is a privilege of the gods. We might note the role of the serpent, which usually is associated with the fertility goddess who is guiding her secret knowledge. The Eridu school of Sumerian theology provides us with an earlier myth of man's fall. The god Ea has created a man, Adapa, who is skilled in navigation. He possessed infinite knowledge, which enabled him to give names to all things with the breath of life. Adapa, in a quarrel with the god of the south wind, breaks the latter's wings, for which crime he is summoned to heaven by the god Anu. Adapa's mentor, the wily god Ea, warns him not to eat or drink anything that might be offered to him in heaven. Obedient to these instructions, Adapa reduces the bread and water of life offered to him by God Anu. He is brought back to earth and held responsible for all the ills that befall humankind. And whatsoever of ill this man has brought upon this man may the horror fall. In these myths, the gods jealously guard their power to grant immortality. Men who aspire to divine knowledge are blamed for bringing evil into the world. We might also note that the means by which humans acquire divine knowledge is by eating and drinking certain substances and by sexual intercourse. We find all these elements, the tree of knowledge, the forbidden fruit, the snake, with its association with the fertility goddess and female sexuality in the biblical story of the fall. The tree of life and its fruit is early associated with the fertility goddess. From the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC on, we see her depicted holding fruit or ears of corn, or alternately, a bowl from which flows the water of life. Some of these symbols are later taken over by kings and rulers. One of the oldest of representations associating the ruler with the tree of life is a statue of Governor Chaya of Lagash, 2275 BC, holding a jar dispensing the water of life in the same pose as that of the goddess Ishtar in a sculpture from Marai. The stele of Namutu of shows the king enthroned sitting before a libation vessel from which water flows and from which the tree of life grows. A mural painting from the palace in Marai depicts the investiture of King Nimri-Lin by the goddess Ishtar. A lower panel shows two goddess-like figures wearing the characteristic crown, each holding a bowl from which flows water on the monumental wall sculptures of the Palace of Ashurbanipal in Assyria, built in the 7th century BC. We see it in a mural depicting the king and queen feasting in an arbor. The motive of the king and his attendants, or some mythical genius figures watering the tree of life, appears in several of the wall reliefs of that palace. The symbol was also widespread in Canaan, where Asherah, the fertility goddess, was symbolized by a stylized tree. Her cult, which was popular in Israel during the patriarchal period, took place in groves of trees. For our purposes, it is worth noting the general direction of the development of this symbol, which fits into the pattern of patriarchal ascendancy we have earlier uncovered. At first, the tree of life with its fruit, the cassia, the pomegranate, the date, the apple, was associated with fertility goddesses. At the time of the development of kingship, kings assumed some of the services to the goddess and with them some of her power, and have themselves depicted with symbols associated with her. They carry the water of life jug. They water the tree of life. It is most likely that this development coincided with the change in the concept of the fertility goddess, namely that she must have a male consort to initiate her fertility. The king of the sacred marriage becomes the king watering the tree of life. This shift is particularly striking in the panels from the Palace of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, which reveal the changes in gender definitions quite dramatically. The king and his servants are huge. They are depicted as warriors in full armor with bulging muscles and carrying weapons. Yet the king carries a watering pot, doing homage to the fertility principle symbolized in the tree of life. Clearly, the locus power has shifted from female to male, but the realm of the goddess cannot be ignored. It must be honored and pacified. Hebrew symbolism was strongly influenced by the Mesopotamian heritage and by that of Israel's Canaanite neighbors. In the story of the fall, we see all the symbolic elements of that heritage emphatically and significantly transformed. There are in the biblical story of paradise two trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Genesis 2:9. The second reference is somewhat ambiguous and makes it appear that the two meanings have merged in one symbol. Of every tree in the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. Genesis 16-17. Since eating from the tree of life is not forbidden here, one might assume the two trees have become merged. But in Genesis 3:22, God specifically separates the two trees and expels Adam and Eve from the garden, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. In the biblical story, the knowledge which is forbidden to humankind is of a dual nature. It is moral knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil, and it is sexual knowledge. When human beings acquire the knowledge of good and evil, they take upon themselves the obligation for making moral decisions, having lost their innocence and with it their ability to carry out the will of God without moral consideration. Fallen humanity, in this act of acquiring a higher level of knowing, assumes the burden of distinguishing between good and evil and of choosing the good in order to be saved. The other aspect of knowledge is sexual knowledge. That is made clear in the line describing one of the consequences of the fall, and they knew they were naked, Genesis 3:7. In this, the consequences of Adam and Eve's transgression fall with uneven weight upon the woman. The associated with the fertility goddess and symbolically represented her. Thus, by God's command, the free and open sexuality of the fertility goddess was to be forbidden to fallen woman. The way her sexuality was to find expression was in motherhood. Her sexuality was so defined as to serve her motherly function, and it was limited by two conditions. She was to be subordinate to her husband, and she would bring forth her children in pain. But there remained the tree of life in the center of the garden. Implicit in the human couple's tasting the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge was that they would aspire to acquiring the mystery of the tree of life, the knowledge of immortality, which is reserved to God. That implication is made clear both in the earlier cited command forbidding the fruit and in God's punishment, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return, Genesis 3:19. To aspire to the knowledge of God is the supreme hubris. The punishment for it is mortality. But God is merciful and redemptive, and so in each punishment, there is also a redemptive aspect. Once and forever, creativity, and with it the secret of immortality, is severed from her creativity. Creativity is reserved to God. Co-creativity of human beings is the lot of women. The curse on Eve makes of it a painful and subordinate lot. But there is another side to the story of the fall. God's curse on Adam ends with assigning him to mortality. Yet, in the very next line, Adam renames his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. This is the profound recognition that in her now lies the only immortality to which human beings can aspire, the immortality of generation. Here is the redemptive aspect of the biblical doctrine of the division of labor between the sexes. Not only shall man work in the sweat of his brow and woman give birth in pain, but mortal men and women depend on the redemptive, life-giving function of the mother for the only immortality they shall ever experience. It is the first act of fallen Adam thus to rename Eve, or rather thus to reinterpret the meaning of her name. Fallen Eve may take hope and courage from her new redemptive role as mother, but there are two conditions defining and limiting her choices. Both of them imposed upon by her God. She is to be severed from the state, and she is to be ruled by her husband. If we understand the snake to be the symbol of the old fertility goddess, this condition is essential to the establishment of monotheism. It will be echoed and reaffirmed in the covenant. There shall be only one God, and the fertility goddess shall be cast out as evil and become the very symbol of sin. We need not strain our interpretation to read this as the condemnation by Yahweh of female sexuality exercised freely and autonomously, even sacredly. The second condition is that Eve, to be honored as life giver, shall be ruled by her husband. It is the law of patriarchy, here clearly defined and given divine sanction. We have seen an earlier development leading towards such a definition in the Code of Hammurabi and in Middle Assyrian law at 40. Here we see it in the form of divine decree fully integrated into a powerful religious worldview. We have seen how the two basic questions, who creates life and who speaks to God, were answered in different cultures, and we have shown how the answer to both questions in the Old Testament affirmed male power over women. To the question, who brought sin and death into the world, Genesis answers woman in her alliance with the snake, which stands for free female sexuality. It is quite in line with such thinking that women should be excluded sexualized women. For females, the book of Genesis represented their definition as creatures essentially different from males, a redefinition of their sexuality as beneficial and redemptive only within the boundaries of patriarchal dominance, and finally, the recognition that they were excluded from directly being able to represent the divine principle. The weight of the biblical narrative seems to decree that by the will of God, women were included in his covenant only through the mediation of men. Here is the historic moment of the death of the mother goddess and her replacement by God the Father and the metaphorical mother under patriarchy. And with that, that ends chapter 9. Let me know if you have any questions. Let's talk about it. Let me know how you feel. Any of the things that I touched on, have you had any of these thoughts or anything similar to it? Let me know. If you don't want to put it in the comments,